It's now my pleasure to welcome to the Autry someone who knows a great deal about first, second, and thirds acts. How's that for a segue, John? You sit there. Acclaimed for his 5 decades of performances on stages and screens. You know him for his roles in The Homesman and the forthcoming Killers of the Flower Moon, the latter directed by Martin Scorsese and co-starring Robert De Niro, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Lily Gladstone. Now, I suspect that those are not the first credits you associate with John Lithgow. But they are his Westerns, so they get pride of place here. And while the names of DiCaprio and Scorsese and De Niro may be more familiar, we at the Autry take great pride in the star billing of Lily Gladstone, who has been a member of our Native Voices at the Autry Theater Company. She was in the first play development workshop of Lying with Badgers and also starred in Off the Rails. And I'm really delighted that this evening, speaking of Native Voices, speaking of Native Voices, we have the dynamic duo that leads the company here this afternoon. Take a bow, Delana Studi and Elisa Blanford. Now, it's not as an actor in first, second, or third acts that John Lithgow comes to us today. Instead, it is as an author and illustrator. His latest book is A Confederacy of Dumpties, Portraits of American Scoundrels in Verse, which I guess is the third act in his Dumpty series. So let me actually move from this microphone.
Good.
Down here, we'll put the book between us in case you want to read, which I hope we'll get you to do.
Yes.
Okay, this is live? Okay, so let me start the conversation by asking you how you came to dig into this gallery of rogues and how you decided which scoundrels merited being skewered in verse. Or as you suggest in the book's introduction, your promise is, we've been here before, and that, this is an interesting one from the Autry's perspective, and that the best way for us to move on is to move back in time, which, as I say, is certainly a perspective that we'll talk about in a moment with the mural. Anyway, if you could just tell us about how you came to this volume and...
Yes. Well, it is a third act. It's a third book in a trilogy. And they are the Dumpty trilogy. The first one was 3 years ago. It was called Dumpty, the Age of Trump in Verse. The second one was called Trumpty Dumpty Wanted a Crown, Verses for a Despotic Age. And then along came A Confederacy of Dumpties. It was my response to what, in my perception, was a chaotic and catastrophic 4-year presidency. And being an entertainer, I suppose some of you share my point of view. Being an entertainer, I felt, well, it was ridiculous for me to be serious on the subject, so why not be satiric? And it's the first time I've sort of gone public, not only with my satire, but my politics at all, really. I've always felt ambivalent about parlaying celebrity, such as it is in my case, to have my voice and my political convictions heard out loud. So I just sort of floated under the radar. Goodness knows I have my politics, but I have not gone public with them. But there was a sort of inciting incident that got me into this world. I was asked to perform in the summer of 2017 at the New York Public Theater Gala. in Central Park in New York City. They have a yearly gala, and this year they were paying tribute to the public's history with musical theater. So there were performances from Hair and A Chorus Line and Hamilton and Fun Home, all these. And they asked me to perform the Major General's song from Pirates of Penzance, since they'd had a big hit with that back in the 70s. And I said, sure, but why don't I do it, this being the summer of 2017, in the person of Michael T. Flynn, and sing, I am the very model of an ex-lieutenant general. He was very much in the news that year because only months before he'd been involved in this huge scandal dealing with the Russians and being fired as national security advisor. And I came out that night in a navy suit and a red tie and a perfect Michael T. Flynn makeup and wig, crew cut black hair and a long beaky nose and a beetle brow, and started singing Gilbert and Sullivan's Major General song. And everybody wondered, what is he doing? Until I got to the third verse, which I had rewritten in the voice of Michael T. Flynn. I introduced myself with the last couplet of the second verse. Then I can hum a tune of which I've heard the music's dinner for. There's never been a general the likes of Michael Flynn afore. And the audience went, oh, that's what he's doing. And then I sang, when President Obama made me head of all things clandestine, he realized he'd brought to life a governmental Frankenstein. But then I made a killing in a case of public pillory by shouting, lock her up, in my harangue opposing Hillary. So I was chosen National Security Advisory until I let the crafty Russian Secret Service hire me. Now I've become the target of a special counsel crime report, a fate I share with Sessions Donald Jr. and with Manafort. Well, this absolutely killed. And like a year later, I was having drinks with my literary agent. I hadn't produced anything literary at all. And he said, come on, there's a book in you. What are you going to write? And we flailed around with all sorts of ideas. And then I remembered this evening, and I sang the song to him. And as I sang the song, this sort of look came over the literary agent's face, like, oh, there's your book. I could sell this tomorrow. And he did. And so he dragged me out into the public eye as a political satirist. And they've all three now been New York Times bestsellers. So it's been very delightful. It's led to things like exactly this, Steve.
But this one, you're digging back in time,
yes,
as opposed to the current events versions that you did in the first two. So I guess I want to press you, since we are a museum about the Western past.
Absolutely.
To talk about some of how you figured out which characters to bring into your rogues gallery, who merited inclusion, and what characteristics brought them to the fore.
Yes, that is the question you asked me about 10 minutes ago. And so I will now answer. I apologize for going way, way, way off the subject. Well, you know, having done two of these books, I was exhausted by it. It's like, and Trump had been voted out of office. I was sick and tired of him entirely. And I didn't want to write another book. They're very hard to write. I mean, it's very tricky, rhyme and verse. But they had been both bestsellers, and my publishers wanted me to do another. I said, no, no, no. And they said, yes, yes, yes. And finally, Mary, my history professor, wife, and colleague of Steve Aron's at UCLA, she said, well, why don't you just discard Trump right away and go back in history? Look at our history of Scoundrels. And this was a fabulous inspiration, because it not only gave me this wonderful entree into history, it gave me a wonderful project to plunge into all these stories that I'd never known before, but it allowed me to, there's a certain delight in writing about how horrible things used to be. It makes things that are happening right now seem a little bit less horrible. So in a way, I sort of wrote this with a certain sense of delight and elation, which is a good thing because the subject is very, very dark, especially if you go back to the middle of the 19th century.
So let us actually do that, and I'm going to ask you to read.
Okay.
Let's actually start with Custer.
Yes.
Since I thought there are two figures in the book who really figure large in the history of the American West. Neither of them are on the mural behind me, but they could have been, for reasons we'll talk about, perhaps. And we'll start with George Armstrong Custer.
Yes. I think you're also referring to Andrew Jackson.
I'm going to get back to Andrew in a moment.
But in fact, there are three figures in the book that are important.
We're going to get to the third, David Rice, too?
Well, the third one is Stephen Aron.
Oh.
Because when I am a complete novice at historical research, and I know a little, but not nearly as much as my wife and her colleagues. I fanned out and I reached out to all my smart friends via my wife, and I asked for a list of villains from their particular field of history. And Steve was wonderful. He immediately responded as if it was a great parlor game. But he said, you must deal with George Armstrong Custer. He's the most Trumpian of them all. And I did. I dove deep under Steve's guidance, and this is what I came up with. And it's a pretty good, it typifies what all the poems are like. It's called The Custer Dash. Of all of the scoundrels presented herewith, one man was a genius at forging his myth. Bathed in the limelight of counterfeit luster, behold the boy general, George Armstrong Custer. Yes, Custer. That sterling American brand, the eponymous martyr of Custer's last stand, was a cat of a different historical stripe, whose story was born of vainglory and hype. Delinquent at West Point and last in his class, through charm and connivance, he managed to pass. Brash and unbridled, his future was bleak, till Fort Sumter ignited his long, lucky streak. Making good use of the grim Civil War, Custer shot up through the raw Union Corps. A brigadier general at age 23, he fixed his attention on posterity. With his reckless heroics and brazen grandstanding, the arc of his story was swiftly expanding. He penned his own press with theatrical flourish, touting Custer's luck and the Custer Dash. He looked upon war as performative art and costumed himself to embody his part, with sombreros and epaulets, tassels to spare, and cinnamon scenting his flowing blonde hair. His thespian vanity had to be fed, even in front of the troops that he led. Tilting with death as a spectator sport, the cavalry charge was his fustian fort. Custer's theatrics, of course, came in handy. His Gettysburg turn was a stiff shot of brandy. The rout of Jeb Stuart was told near and far, and George Armstrong Custer emerged as a star. The South had surrendered, the Union had won, but Custer still clung to his saber and gun. With the thrill of the chase in his veins and his pores, he pointed his horse to the Indian Wars. The nation was opening broad new expanses, treading throughout Oklahoma and Kansas. But the Pawnee, Arapaho, Sioux, and Cheyenne were resisting America's grand master plan. Custer in buckskin cried, "Leave it to me! I'm all for expanding the land of the free. My army and I will take matters in hand. We'll break all their treaties and take all their land." An unlikely companion rode out by his side. Elizabeth Bacon, his Civil War bride. Libby played a dual role in their marital pact, a wife and a press agent hawking his act. Custer, the reckless and rash martinet, needed all the good press he could possibly get. His intemperance, peppered with blunt self-promotion, brought censure, court-martial, reproach, and demotion. Libby stepped in as his image adjuster, demanding the public let Custer be Custer. She used every arrow she had in her quiver to soften the carnage at Washita River. But the real Custer legend was finally born on the Montana plains by the Little Bighorn. When Crazy Horse and his warriors struck, they rang down the curtain on Custer's luck. Custer's finale was self-orchestrated, his cavalry trapped and annihilated. He died an impetuous, foolhardy jerk. But Libby recovered and went right to work. She gilded his story and burnished his name, a fastidious keeper of Custer's flame. Over 56 years of devout adulation, she saved him from factual deconsecration. Most of us swallowed her rapt hagiography, suckers for drama and martial pornography. We shucked our misgivings and struck up the band for the spurious fable of Custer's last stand. But today, Custer's epic has grown cautionary, a timely reminder to warn the unwary. When a scoundrel from history exits the stage, fictions will turn into facts as they age.
One more? So, as I said, there are two who, two figures, I think, who loom large, and as I said, could have been on this mural. And you know, it's interesting. As I said, I really wanted to hold this program here in Heritage Court, and with the mural open to see. The mural, which I hope everyone has had an opportunity now to see the recent documentary, Imagined West, on KCET. And I want to acknowledge Juan, who was behind that. That really, I think, explains how this mural came to be, the history it presented, the ways in which that history served as a orientation place, orientation for this museum when it opened, but the ways in which this museum has evolved and changed with changing times and changing interpretations and changing curatorial practices. And what I really also loved about the documentary is the ways in which it also moves us beyond the dichotomy that the only thing we can do with murals or art or monuments of figures, even Custer, or the one we'll hear about in a moment, Andrew Jackson, who have fallen from their pedestals. The only thing we can do is either to remove them and trash them, or erase them, or leave it as is, in a sense. And I think the documentary really opened up fertile ground that goes far beyond the Autry and this mural in thinking about the way in which we need to grapple with past monuments and memories, including figures like George Armstrong Custer, who, why wasn't he on the mural, Josh? And Andrew Jackson, who could be on the mural. And I'd ask you actually to read Old Hickory too.
And
yes, then maybe we'll reflect a little bit. When I raised this point with John earlier, he said, well, I'm not a scholar. I'm not going to, I'm not going there. But I feel like you're married to a historian. You played a professor on TV for many years. Surely that qualifies you. So, Old Hickory.
Well, I know a lot more than I did before I ventured into this. And I certainly learned a lot about Andrew Jackson, a man of, well, here's my feelings about Andrew Jackson. Yes, the poem is called Old Hickory. Consider Andrew Jackson, the illustrious old Hickory, a man of contradictions, of integrity and trickery, of prudence and impulsiveness, of cruelty and kindness, of coarseness and of dignity, of vision and of blindness. From his Carolina childhood and his teens in Tennessee, no one could have guessed the boy's impressive destiny. Civility and polished, Andy Jackson didn't bother. He was more a scrappy foundling than a dapper founding father. A trigger-happy recklessness was Jackson's youthful essence, a temperament that fit a nation's early adolescence. When Southern tribes all mobilized to save their native land, Andy led an army down to lend a helping hand. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw, the Cherokee and Creek would bow before the havoc that old Hickory would wreak. Taking center stage in this chaotic diorama, he paved the way for statehood in the future Alabama. Then our embryonic nation, so intemperate and skittish, found a unifying hero in the war against the British. At the Battle of New Orleans, in a stunning blaze of glory, Andrew Jackson wrote a chapter in our long unfolding story. His fame begat a resume that no one could begrudge. A congressman, a governor, a senator, a judge, a planter, living lavishly and sparing no expense, then a member of the pantheon of U.S. presidents. But once inside the White House, Andy's sterling reputation would hit the boiling waters of dispute and condemnation. Though he boasted a devotion to a country proud and free, a national disgrace would soon deface his legacy. This agonizing episode is sadly half forgotten. The displacement of a race to clear the South for planting cotton. With the Indian problem missing from the U.S. Constitution, the Indian Removal Act was Jackson's grim solution. Abandoning persuasion and resorting to extortion, he launched a mass migration of near biblical proportion. With cruelty unmatched in all these intervening years, 5 tribes were banished westward on the tragic trail of tears. Through the autocratic actions of a suspect national hero, a proud and ancient multitude was cut to nearly zero. Behold the bitter consequence of presidential orders, ethnic cleansing carried out inside our nation's borders. Irony will frequently dispense a bitter pill. Jackson is emblazoned on the $20 bill. But the Dumpty years provide the sharpest irony of all, a portrait of old Hickory on the Oval Office wall.
As I said, you know, the thing about Jackson, and I know the Autry staff read this because I sent it in my Monday message, that surprised me when I was, you know, is that how recent is his fall, relatively speaking? That, you know, when you look at the polls that historians do of sort of ranking the presidents, it was not a surprise to me that in the mid-20th century, Andrew Jackson is in the pantheon. He's always ranked great, and really only Lincoln and Washington and Jefferson and Franklin Roosevelt rank above him. And it's even as late as when, I pointed out, when John Kennedy is announcing the new frontier, Jackson as the hero of the old frontier remains sort of still ranked great. So it's really only in the last 50 or 60 years, and again, this ties back to the way in which the interpretation on the mural also falls out of favor, that it's changed. Now, my little couplet, which I suggested, which doesn't rise to Lithgowian things, is once historians started to grapple with race, Andrew Jackson fell from grace. Okay, I realize that I'm not, you know, neither my reading of it nor my poetry rises to this level. But I do think the point is sort of interesting, that how relatively recent is the idea that Andrew Jackson is back in the category. Now, there were many people in the 1830s who certainly thought him a scoundrel. Henry Clay, who I wrote a book about, certainly did that. But you know, as I said, it's only in the last 2 or 3 decades that he's sort of moved into your rogues, or would have been seen as a fit character for your rogues gallery. I'm not sure what you make of that.
Well, I mean, we are in such an astonishing moment. Really, not just the last 30 years or 20 years, but the last 2 years. You do have this strong sense of old history books cracking open and revealing all sorts of realizations. And for me, it was simply extraordinary. An extraordinary moment in my life at age 75 to go plunging back into things that I had just never contemplated before. And so much of it has to do with exactly what we're talking about. The fact that our last election was a contested election, and that everybody was talking about another contested election back in 1876, which was the 100th anniversary of our nation. It made me go back and look at 1876 and ask the question, well, what was the contest? What was the contest? And I was overwhelmed by what I found. And it's perfectly, this is a real primer. This is American History 101 for everybody else. But I really was not aware of that, what a demarcation point that year was. And I ended up writing a poem.
Can you read that one?
I will, if I can find it.
Centennial.
Yes.
It's right after.
Centennial Day, 1876. Well, you will recognize all sorts of reference points with concurrent politics, but I'm just going to read it and let the chips fall where they may. Centennial Day, 1876. They say with Appomattox, the Confederacy was done. After Gettysburg and Shiloh, Antietam and Bull Run. But with all the deep divisions that our history has wrought, examples prove the Civil War continues to be fought. Take a brief excursion through historical arcana, starting off with Colfax, mid-Louisiana. Add Tulsa, Slocum, Wilmington, Polk County, Thibodaux, and a dozen other massacres from not so long ago. Centennial Day in Hamburg, the birthday of the nation. A crush of South Carolinians whooped in celebration. A snappy black militia headed up a joyful crowd, emancipated freedmen, parading tall and proud. But a national election loomed a few short months away. Local ex-Confederates foresaw Redemption Day. With the Civil War behind them, their intent was crystal clear: restore their former glory through ferocity and fear. They called themselves the Red Shirts, a fire-breathing scourge pouring into Hamburg to terrorize and purge. Benjamin Ryan Tillman was a leader of this brood, a plantation owner fixed on reinstating servitude. 1,000 strong, the red shirt throng beset the black gendarmerie, then chased them from the safety and protection of their armory. 8 killed and dozens wounded by the time their rage was sated. Among the dead, the local marshal, slain and mutilated. Though 90 were indicted for this lawless insurrection, their trials were postponed until the pending post-election. But the ringing voice of justice in the end was sadly muted. Of all the bloody red shirts, not a one was prosecuted. As for Tillman, he took mutiny and murder in his stride, flaunting Hamburg carnage as a point of racial pride. In politics, the vilest, most bigoted of men, as a governor and senator, they called him Pitchfork Ben. But Hamburg was the preview to an existential fix, the contested presidential race of 1876. The South had risen once again to even up the score, wielding politics and terror to refight the Civil War. For them, the ballot deadlock, with its bitter tribal rift, turned out to be an unexpected 100th birthday gift. They scuttled Reconstruction with their faces all aglow. You can have your president if we can have Jim Crow. The massacre in Hamburg dealt a tragic mortal wound, its dwindling population rendered broken and marooned. 1927 saw its poignant dying day. The Savannah River overflowed and washed the town away. Today, a golf course spreads across the broad and breezy land where the peaceable community of Hamburg used to stand. As Carolina golfers walk the fairways and the greens, the thought of strife and slaughter almost never intervenes. But take a moment. Think about the 6th of January, a blast of passion, murderous and insurrectionary. Then picture Trumpty Dumpty, the man who would be king, standing on the tee box and practicing his swing.
At the Autry, obviously, our mission statement, as we talked about when we were talking about Rick's legacy, we talk a lot about connecting the past with the present to inspire our shared future. And these, I think you've seen just a taste of how John's history is very much entwined with the present moment. In fact, maybe I'll have you do one more, and then we'll open up for a few questions from the audience. But one more, well, actually, let me ask you, because these figures in the, and where you have the Judge Hall at the end, but you're going to find it, right?
Yes.
Okay. The Man Who Made Kansas Bleed, right? That's the title?
The Man Who Made Kansas Bleed.
The Man Who Made Kansas Bleed. And I'm thinking of, well, let's see. We have an erudite audience here. Let's see, talking about forgotten figures,
yes.
Forgotten scoundrels. We'll give a bonus point on the quiz at the end of the day if anyone can tell me David Rice Atchison's, what state he was a senator from.
And a more appropriate question is, has anybody heard of David Rice Atchison? Raise your hands if you've heard of David Rice Atchison.
Okay.
And the fewer the better, as far as I'm concerned.
All right.
Yeah.
The Man Who Made Kansas Bleed.
It's one of the delights of this is to have found so many scoundrels that I had never heard of, and neither has anyone else. The Man Who Made Kansas Bleed. We've been sated with the saga of our bloody Civil War, but not its dress rehearsal, half a dozen years before. Of all our fratricidal brawls, the Civil War was worst. Yet look a little closer. Bleeding Kansas happened first. Mid-century, the nation had to choose its mortal fate, whether slavery prevailed in every newly minted state. When Kansas slavers clashed with abolitionist free staters, a Missouri man commanded the pro-slaver instigators, David Rice Atchison, the firebrand of the fray, defender of the firm belief that slaves were here to stay. Atchison's adventures tell a dark and gruesome story, a bid to export slavery to the Kansas territory. As a boyish U.S. senator, he sprung his first surprise, legislatively upending the Missouri Compromise. He intoned his pious mantra, "We should let the voters choose," leaving Kansas abolitionists all shaking in their shoes. Thus empowered, David hurried home to launch a new offense, a scheme to people Kansas with like-minded immigrants. He even formed a namesake town, dispensing sundry favors. Join us here in Atchison, you sturdy young pro-slavers. But for David and his followers, the obstacles were legion, since thousands more free staters immigrated to the region. The quarrel reached a fever pitch in 1855. An election would determine which arrangement would survive. But elections can be iffy in a hostile atmosphere, especially when held on the American frontier. Atchison, anticipating loss and dispossession, chose violence and voter fraud, coercion and suppression. He recruited a militia, the Proud Boys of their day. He called them border ruffians. Free staters were their prey. March 30th, Election Day, this bloody-minded throng thundered into Kansas in a mob 5,000 strong. They terrorized the countryside and stormed the polling places, a raid that takes its place among our national disgraces. The Kansas fields and furrows were soaked with Kansas blood, and our precious young democracy was trampled in the mud. The election was contested, leaving chaos in its wake. The future of the Kansas social contract was at stake. 2 capitals, 2 governors, 2 separate societies, 2 state constitutions, and a dueling set of pieties. Conflicts kept arising like a tide of roiling torrents. Pro-slavers staged the sacking and the sleepy town of Lawrence. Disorder in the Congress shook the nation to its core with the caning of Charles Sumner on the U.S. Senate floor. Such eruptions woke the anger of the infamous John Brown. He led his band of trustees west to bring the slavers down. Avenging Lawrence, Brown unleashed another killing spree, 5 pro-slavers slain beside the Pottawatomie. These tit-for-tat atrocities and many murders more would soon be overshadowed by a cataclysmic war. But once astute historians send all of their dispatches in, you'll hear a lot of echoes of Missouri's David Atchison. And take a moment, jump ahead 160 years. Another mob, another siege, more rage and tribal fears. A young, intemperate senator, defiant, brash, and brawly, his face extended in the air, Missourian Josh Hawley.
And now you'll all know who David Rice Atchison is. Do we have a few minutes for some questions? I don't know if we have a microphone to go around. We do. So if anyone has a question they'd like to ask. While we're waiting for the microphone to go around, John, I'll ask the question I ask all guests here. What's your favorite Western?
I have to say High Noon. And I bet
Oh, right. You have a shirt.
I bet a lot of people say that. But also, Unforgiven is a great, more contemporary Western. Just saw a very interesting Western, The Power of the Dog.
Oh, I was going to say, it's just out on Netflix now.
Yeah.
When? Your review?
Oh, I think it's great. It's not like any Western you have ever seen, but it's spellbinding, and Benedict Cumberbatch is one hell of an actor.
I think it's filmed in New Zealand, though.
Yeah. And my Montana wife, she shook her head all through it. That's not Montana.
Would you consider doing another book of Scoundrels Through World History? I think you have about 12 volumes.
You know, I am so tapped out at the moment, but then I felt that way after the second book. We'll see. I never say never. Well, I did say never, and then I broke my own rule. But gosh, I mean, I could give you another list of 20 scoundrels. I had a huge...
Who missed the cut?
I was sorry I didn't get around to Andrew Johnson. And I did this extraordinary film, which you will see next year, The Killers of the Flower Moon. And there is a villain in that, a villain in the state of Oklahoma named William Vail, who is a jaw-dropping villain. He's played in the film by Robert De Niro. And you got to see that film.
Who do you play in the film?
I play, it's a small role toward the end. the sort of Atticus Finch figure, the prosecutor who unravels this extraordinary plot that has obtained all through both the book and the movie. Raise your hands if you've read the book. Then you know what an extraordinary, an appalling tale it is. And imagine having finished this book to finally learn about Killers of the Flower Moon and think, oh, damn, what I missed.
Other questions? Yeah, there we go.
Could you list all of the villains that you have in your book?
Well, sure. I'll see if I can rattle through them.
Or as many as you can remember.
Yeah. By the way, the end paper has a very attractive gallery of several others.
Drawn by the illustrator
Yes,
is here too.
I'm the illustrator too.
And all of the poems also are illustrated too. So they're caricaturists.
And you'll be happy to know that on the title page it says, "For Steve and Amy, with love as ever, and thanks, John Lithgow," because it belongs to them. Here are the subjects. Donald Trump, of course, Andrew Jackson, David Acheson. The Wizard of the Saddle was Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nasty Business, one of my favorites, is about Boss Tweed and his satirist, Thomas Nast. The Great Pyramids of Sarah Howe, an extraordinary woman scoundrel. It took a lot of looking, but she's amazing. George Armstrong, Custer, Centennial Day, you just heard. Typhoid Mary, Albert Fall from the Teapot Joan, the Goat Gland Doctor, this incredible story.
Does anyone have?
John Romulus Brinkley, anybody hear of him? You gotta buy this book.
Which we have on sale, and we'll do a book signing
sign them for
upstairs right after this program.
There's a poem called The Wonder Boy about Roy M. Cohn. That's another of my favorites. Spiro Zero about Spiro Agnew. The Queen of Mean about Leona Helmsley, New York real estate maven. The Secret Life of Newts is about Newt Gingrich. Madoff Straight Off is about you-know-who. And then...
You have limericks, maybe a few limericks.
The limericks, it's a chronological book that takes you up to the present day. And the second to the last poem is a set of a dozen limericks for the here and now, which they include Ted Cruz, Rudy Giuliani, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz.
Well,
Wayne.
let's hear. How about for Marjorie?
Oh, I'll do. Yes. This is a typical one. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a fountain of hatred and spleen. When she opens her trap, her fanatical crap can shatter a video screen. And then we have Mike Lindell of My Pillow. We have Alex Jones. We have Elise Stefanik, Sidney Powell. I'll read you a quick Sidney Powell. Sidney Powell, the POTUS's minion, replaced fact with outlandish opinion, but she trembled with fear for her tarnished career when she learned she'd been sued by Dominion. Then we have Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. We have Ron DeSantis. We have Lindsey Graham and...
Let's hear Lindsey.
Okay. Lindsey Graham, that browbeaten fawn, is anyone's pliable pawn. He faces travail with the balls of a snail and the spine of a groveling prawn. and the last one is each McConnell political act has a physiologic impact. For Mitch, legislation connotes constipation of the nation's intestinal tract. So that's my limericks.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh.
Have you ever thought about putting them to music?
Oh.
Like Tom Lehrer?
Actually, I haven't. My first couple of books included a couple of lyrics to familiar songs. I included the Michael T. Flynn Major General song among them. But I have done a series of remarkable videos that you can actually find online to promote the book, but also just for for the fun of it. I worked with 3 wonderful guys who created something called Triptych Productions. And they're basically animated videos with me reciting, and the illustrations come to life, including a watercolor wash. I urge you to look online for that. And for the middle book, I recruited, that was released in the middle of the pandemic, so there was no book tour to be done. I couldn't make any personal appearances. So I invited friends of mine to recite my poems and film themselves doing it. And Triptych spun those into wonderful little videos, including Glenn Close and Meryl Streep and Annette Bening and Samuel Jackson and just all these wonderfully glitzy, glittery people. None of them did the poems as well as I did, but they were awfully famous.
Question? Any questions more? Then I hope, oh, wait, over here. They always make it as far for you to go as possible.
Okay, first of all, I just want to say thank you for all the laughs. My goodness, man. And, you know, you mentioned Samuel Jackson. Is there any possibility of you being in the Marvel Universe?
Well, as I say, I never say no, but I have to be asked first. You know, it's like, no. I did one spectacular villain, sort of Marvel Universe villain back in the 80s, but it was in a kind of send-up of action films called The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. I played Dr. Emilio Lizardo. But I'm...
Well, actually, as long as we're plugging, you should plug what you're in on Tuesday. Is it Tuesday night?
Yes.
So,
oh, God.
You could see him.
My career is so nutty. Yes. Jimmy Kimmel and Norman Lear have created this amazing phenomenon. You may have heard about it. For the last 2 years in the month of December, they've taken classic episodes from the Norman Lear universe, All in the Family, the Jeffersons, and they have hired modern-day actors to perform the scripts in the sitcom mode and to broadcast it live on a single night. And Tuesday night, I will be Mr. Drummond in different strokes. Oh, yeah. with Gary Coleman being played by Kevin Hart. How about that? You don't want to miss this. It may just be my finest work.
All right. With that, I think one more? One more. We'll give one more question. Then we're going to get some books signed. Sold and signed. Sold and signed.
My mind is having incredible difficulty dealing with living in a country that can produce Rittenhouse and Ahmaud Arbery within a week. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm stunned like everyone. I feel like the nation has had a horrible midlife crisis. I get the feeling, I've sort of referred to it, of a Pandora's box leaping open. I think we're all confronting a couple of major original sins that go back so far. And it's a remarkable moment in our history, I think, and it's heartbreaking, it's appalling, but it's very exciting to see our truths being confronted and wrestled with. The terrible thing is that it has divided our country so desperately, and my own feeling in a large sense is the country has been most together at times of catastrophic crises. But those crises have all happened outside of our nation, and we've all come together to confront them. This should have been the case with the coronavirus, but because of our terrible leadership, it didn't happen. It divided us more than ever. I look at this and I think, I swing like a pendulum between horror and hope. And I think that's pretty much what we all feel right now. And I think that's a very good question to end with.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Rick, for everything you've done. Thank you, John. We are going to go upstairs for book signing, and books are on sale in the store, which is open, and you will sign?
I will sign.
We will sign. So don't hold him here. Let him get upstairs so we can sign some books. And thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.